You guys think through that part? I heard you refer to it a couple times.
Yeah, we've been kind of mulling it over. It would have to be some sort of like deeper concrete, maybe even a slab with some sort of like anchor bolt, some sort of like redhead bolt drilled into the bottom of that.
So would you say that maybe the plaque and the boulder are kind of equivalent in terms of cost based on that? Seemed like it to me, but
I would say so. Considering the time spent in order to build that, also it's up for discussion too. If we get a large enough boulder, you just set it in the right of way.
just put it there.
If somebody really wants to take it, you're kind of like, you earned it.
The same thing could happen with the post, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, if they really wanted it, those aren't concreted in. If they really wanted it, they could take it.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any public comment on this one, Melissa? I'm personally a big fan of the bronze plaque on the beam that we're looking at right now. That feels very familiar as someone that's hiked a lot of trails and seen things that feel like this. I'm preferential towards that, but I'd be curious to hear what other people think.
I think that overall the return with the new kind of iteration of this exhibits a lot of like receptivity to the specific feedback that was received last time. So I'm grateful that the city staff have kind of, gotten creative to work with us on trying to offer like a really respectable product. And the one thing that I think kind of stands out to me, I've worked with signs a little bit and mostly through the botanical garden setting that Rob alluded to. And I think that there's an advantage to having the presentation of the information kind of more, at least like waist high or so, and particularly for people who are not as able to get up and down. And so something like the boulder speaks to me because it's got this organic thing to it, but I can't really, it's hard for me to creatively envision something that is elegant that would present that as nicely as a clean plaque on a post like we're looking at.
Yeah, I have the same concerns with the boulder. If there's some weeds or grasses or something growing in front of it, it seems like it could get obscured pretty easily. How do we feel about adding a QR code to the beam that we're looking at right there?
Can you remind me what the QR code leads to? Is it a specific page for that specific instance, or is it a general page? How much maintenance is required on the content?
Not much. Most of our, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, most of our content is currently up to date. The reason that we wanted to do that or reference the website was the submissions of inaccuracies that we kept getting. This tree was planted in 1942, not 1943. It was, it's not this species, it's actually this species. Oh wait, no, it's this species after we created a new plaque. There was these things that were happening and kind of going back and forth where we decided this information could be contained on the website and manipulated very easily, much easier than creating a new plaque every time there was a discrepancy. Really what this stemmed from was at least in our heads, where it stemmed from was the map that we wanted to put on there for the Heritage Grove, the kind of "you are here" map, as opposed to putting it on a larger 18 by 24 plaque.
So it would be for that specific grove.
Essentially,
that QR
yeah.
code would lead you to a page that was for that grove.
And it would show you,
Gotcha.
you are here, these are where these specific trees are within this grove, et cetera. And, it would also take you to additional information, but it's a lot easier when there's one tree right in front of you to know where you are in relation to that tree, right? But there could be additional information on the website about that tree if you want to learn about it.
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense to have it all in one, if that was the question.
Yeah, because we have a big item to get to here. I'm going to take a stab at making a motion on this. I'm going to move to go with this, we're calling it a bronze plaque, with the asterisk that, of course, we want the correct imagery of the plant on there. At staff's discretion, if we could do a cedar or a redwood post instead of PT. And I'm personally good with the QR code being somewhere there lower on the beam, as that is of use to some people that would want more information.
I'd like to second your motion.
Is there anybody else that would like to weigh in before we vote on that?
Just some discussion. Do you have a preference about size of the plaque?
Seems like it's denoted here as a 6x6 plaque. Were there any other, oh, I see there's a couple options.
There's a 5 by 8 3/4.
The 6x6 would fit on we'd need an 8x8 beam because a 6x6 beam is actually 5.5.
Yeah. And then when you
So-
cut it, we cut it at an angle,
Right.
and it sits on there, yeah.
Yeah, so a 6x6 plaque could go on an 8x8 beam.
Mhm.
That feels good to me. Does anybody else have a thought on that?
I think the size seems fine. I'm just still uncertain. Is the QR code going on a separate spot on the post? Would that be the plan?
Yes, that's the
And
plan, yeah.
I think it's important I also, first of all, want to say, like Tony said, I really appreciate the work that you've done and listening to the public comments, which were very rich, and it's great that people were participating, so I appreciate you listening to that. I thought we got really good feedback from the public. I wonder if you can research elegant ways of showcasing a QR code. Aesthetically pleasing QR codes. Don't know if they exist, but I think it'd be great to find out.
We can definitely look into it.
Yeah, I think that's something for the sake of moving this forward, leaving it to their discretion to do the best. But in my mind, it's kind of below the yellow bar that we see there.
That's, yeah, kind of the yellow bar would represent about where the QR code would be.
Okay. Great. Are we clear on the motion? Are we ready to vote? Yeah. All right, let's do it. Okay, excellent. That's approved unanimously, which will take us to agenda item number 4. So this is a big one. It's an important one. I want to lay out a little bit of how I hope to move through this efficiently tonight. I'm going to start off by asking the subcommittee to do a little summary of where we started and where we're going with the revision, have them do their disclosures of anything that's transpired since the last meeting with the subcommittee. After that, I'm going to ask committee member Gurno to respond to a concern about tree valuation that had been brought up at the last meeting that we didn't have the time to get to. After that, after disclosures, then I'll lay out how we're going to move through these 13 items, but let's start with those two.
Thank you. My name is Linda Schneider. I've been working on this subcommittee with Matt Palumbo for the last several months. Tonight is our 4th meeting discussing the mature tree ordinance. So I wanted to step back just for a moment and talk about what it is we're trying to achieve with the ordinance, and then how the proposed revision of the subcommittee differs from the original draft of the ordinance that we received from the city. So going to the purposes for the ordinance, first is to retain mature trees in the city, particularly when property is being developed. Secondly, disincentivize property owners and developers from removing trees before engaging with the city in planning for development and seeking permits. Third, incentivize property owners and developers to retain mature trees and create plans to build around them. Fourth, when mature trees cannot be retained because of development, replace them with a greater number of new trees and more native trees than the number that were removed, resulting in a larger number of trees and higher quality species of trees growing in the future. And fifth, in terms of goals, maintain flexibility for property owners in the city with respect to the trees growing on their property, whether to retain trees or remove them, except when the property is being developed with new or enlarged structures, whereupon trees should be preserved. So then turning to what is the difference between the proposed revision that we put forth in our meeting last month and then a refined one with respect to the, attached to the agenda packet for tonight's meeting. First, the revision simplifies the ordinance by improving organization and some phrasing, which makes it clearer and more understandable. It's also a nice benefit that it shortens it from 10 pages down to 6. Second, we moved the technical requirements from the ordinance into the Urban Forestry Management Program Administrative Manual of Procedures, particularly the original subdivision H, which provided for 14 protection requirements during construction, and subdivision J, which dealt with applications for private and public development projects. Third, the difference is we sought to include all property in the city, both public and private, but to make clear that the ordinance is applicable only in development situations. The ordinance would not be applicable if there would not be any development on the property within 2 years. The original draft C2 had confusing language, private property is subject to development. And because every property can be developed, that includes all properties in the city, but then it included some zones of property but not others, and then exempted SB 9 projects. So that language was confusing and we sought to clarify it. Then in key provisions under subdivision G, the revision makes clear that it's applicable only in development context, which we thought was previously unclear. Secondly, mitigation standards are changed. The original G5, subdivision G5, set forth a hierarchy of relocation, replacement, and then pay fees in lieu. And the revision includes only to pay fees and no relocation or replacement, although the committee tonight is expected to deal with an issue of whether to put replacement back into the ordinance. Then the revision added G3 to require a project site to include the requisite species, size, and number of trees required by city development standards or guidelines, or alternatively to put in development standards with respect to trees in that subdivision G. Then number 5, the original subdivision K was removal not related to projects, and that was replaced in the revision by subdivision F, which includes a permit for removal of a mature tree within 2 years before applying for a construction permit. And this provision disincentivizes a developer from removing a tree within that 2-year period, because doing so without a permit subjects them to really very stiff penalties, 3 times the appraised value of the removed tree, plus not being able to get any building permit in the city for up to 2 years. At the same time, all residents who are not developing their property do not have to worry about getting a tree removal permit at all. And then lastly is what was the original subdivision O, and in the revision is subdivision L on enforcement, We removed the penalty of misdemeanor and added a penalty for removing a mature tree without a permit within 2 years prior to filing an application for a building permit, which included 2 things. Number 1, pay 3 times the appraised value of the mature tree, and number 2, be denied a building permit for up to 2 years. These are strong incentives to prevent developers from clearing trees in advance of development. So that's the summary.
Great, thank you so much. And are there any disclosures or updates the subcommittee can provide for anything that's happened since last month?
First of all, we went through the entire record from last month's meeting and reviewed all of the comments that were made by public members and the committee members, and cataloged all those to try to incorporate into the revision of the mature tree ordinance. So the mature tree ordinance that is presented on the agenda tonight is a revision that is taken all that feedback into account. Not every item was included for one reason or another, but every item was considered in the newest draft of the revision. Secondly, I did some outreach to get a better understanding of appraisals of trees, particularly appraisal if a tree has been removed and is no longer present to evaluate. So we had heard at our meeting last month some commentary about that, and I wanted to find out more information on it. So I followed a few leads. I talked to a couple of different arborists, and I was led to a gentleman by the name of Ron Matranga, Matranga, who is the president of the American Society of Consulting Arborists. And he provided information about how appraisers do deal with the issue of trees being removed and then having to appraise them. And he walked me through some of the items that they consider, starting with species of the tree, and they have they use rankings of different species in terms of their desirability, 1 through 5. Then they go to condition of the tree and various other factors, some of which would have been known, some which may not be known. But then he also talked about forensic evidence on determining, what tree was there previously, such as aerial photographs of trees, Google streetscape photos of trees, I think that's what it's called. Photos that people have in their personal possession, whether it be the property owner or perhaps people who have property adjacent to where the tree was taken down, et cetera. So he said it's common in arbor appraisal to have to come up with values of trees that have been removed. He said if a stump is present, that is certainly a big benefit, because knowing exactly how big a stump is tells you a lot about how large the tree was. But if it is not present, it can still be determined. So I had that outreach, and then the other was I spoke with Evan Jedinak and Megan Openshaw, who are present here tonight. Megan is the Assistant Director of the Development Services Department in the city, and Evan is a Senior Mobility Planner in the Planning Department. And I spoke with them about the feedback their staff could provide to us on the revision of the mature tree ordinance that we had prepared so far. And we received some very valuable impact from them, both historically and with respect to their views working in the department and knowing how things are processed. So I hate to speak for you because you're here, but it was pointed out to me 3 issues that they had some concern about. One is the applicability section of the ordinance, and as we've had much discussion about that section, we know how sensitive the issue is. On the one hand, if the ordinance is applicable to all property in the city, then it can do its greatest benefit in protecting trees. On the other hand, if it is applicable to all property in the city, there are certain people who own property in the city that may not want to have that ordinance be subject to their property because it adds a burden on them. Whether or not it comes up, maybe yes, maybe no, but it could potentially add a burden of another ordinance on, that would govern their conduct. So we know about that one, and that the city had received quite a bit of public feedback on that issue before the ordinance came to our committee this spring. Secondly, the issue of mitigation. If mature trees are removed, then our proposed revision of the ordinance indicates that fees would be paid in lieu of either relocating a tree or replacing a tree, as the original ordinance had indicated. And this was an issue of concern because I was informed that City Council, when they looked at this previously, they were very much in favor of having replacement trees, and that they felt that fees in lieu was really sort of a last resort. I was informed that not having relocation of a mature tree, after considering what the committee discussed about that and how really infeasible it is and inexpensive and not likely to succeed, that's probably a good thing to take out of the ordinance. But replacement of trees is probably a good thing to keep in the ordinance. That's why I alluded to in my initial comments that that's probably something we should take a look at again tonight. Then the third thing was adding in the permit requirement. If a tree is removed within 2 years prior to a development permit being sought, it would require a tree removal permit. And the feedback on that was that adding another permit to the city's scheme is something they weren't sure it would be great because of just administrative burden on the city as well as other people who have to deal with permits, such as property owners who have to file for a permit and going through the permit process. But on the other hand, that in the context, the way the revision was drafted, that it might be a good idea to have the permit for within 2 years before development occurs. So I think that's a summary of what we did in the last. Keep in mind too, you only really have 2 weeks because you have to get all your documents in. But that's where we are now. And what hope to accomplish tonight is to go through the most recent revision, get the committee's take on the 13 items that we teed up that could kind of go one way or another, and then try to finalize a revision so that we could pass it along to whoever's next. Oh, that's one more thing I forgot to mention. When I spoke with Evan and Megan, we discussed where does this go from here? What happens after UFAC makes its recommendations? And there was discussion whether it should go back to City Council or whether it should go back to the Planning Department, et cetera. So I looked up the UFAC minutes from March of 2025 when Mayor Ehlers came into UFAC and gave us sort of his take on the ordinance and asking for our help in trying to improve it. And his suggestion was that it would go back to the Planning Commission and to the Environmental Commission and then back to City Council, and at that point potentially obtain further public input of some sort. So I shared that with them as well, but I think they would be the decision makers or help steer the project to wherever it will go next. So that's my report.
Excellent, thank you so much. Before I turn it over to Tony Gurno, is there anything that staff would like to add to what Linda said there?
Certainly, and good evening, members of the Urban Forest Advisory Committee. My name is Megan Openshaw, Assistant Director for the Development Services Department, and I'm quite new. So excuse me for not having my nameplate today. But that was a very comprehensive and accurate summary, Committee Member Schneider, so thank you very much for putting that together. And I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all of the work that you have all done with this process, and how much time and expertise that you have brought with your comments with this. I'd also like to I attended the previous UFAC meeting as well, and I noticed that the way that it was developed was to amend the actual ordinance. And so I think that puts a heavy burden on you, and I'm sure that's probably part of the reason why it continues to go through the multiple iterations with that. But what I think, because you've put all of that work and effort and have utilized that format, you've been able to come up with really wonderful recommendations that I think the City Council will take into consideration. And so I just want to put a reminder and provide us as staff resources that we would really like to format to basically synthesize everything that you've put into this and make it so that is in the format of recommendations to ensure that we can have the City Council and other bodies really make the substantive recommendations on what they would like to see in the final ordinance. And so my hope is that they can provide guidance based off of your expertise about what they would like to see in the content of that, so staff can reflect what the community would like to see, what you would like to see, as well as specifically what council and other bodies would like to see, and ultimately council. But we really appreciate everything you've done so far, and we're here and we're available for any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's definitely a number of specifics we're going to get into later, so chime in if you feel that there's any relevant opinion you want to share. And then Tony Gurno, there was a comment last month from a citizen that was brought up the hypothetical of she wanted to remove, I believe it was an African tulip tree or some similar, you call them a junk tree, and then decides to sell her house, and now she's going to be on the hook for the value of that tree if she sells that house within 2 years. And I know you had some thoughts to share on that, but we didn't have time last month, so I just wanted to give you a chance to address that now.
Thank you. There are a variety of different ways to appraise plants generally, and some of them are pretty dissonant from other methodologies. With trees in particular, there's a couple of different ones in action, largely in the industry, and there's actually a movement within the professional tree care industry at the moment to kind of settle into one agreed upon methodological approach to appraising trees. But I'll give you, I don't expect that many people are familiar with these processes because it's a pretty niche skill set even within the professional arboricultural community. So think about it as though you have the best case version of a given tree. And in this case, it was a Spathodia campanulata, the African tulip tree. And envision the best version of that tree in terms of health and structure and placement within the landscape. And there's a formula involving several different factors related to things like tree species and ecological appropriateness and some of these kind of like concepts that relate to something that we talk a lot more simply about, which is the right plant in the right place. And so you come up with the best case version of this tree in a platonic environment where it is the absolute perfect version of that. And there's a price arrangement that's determined for that tree. And then from there, the way that the appraisal process works is that you essentially start to work through a rubric that almost grades the tree on different features, health considerations, siting considerations, and these are all detractors from that kind of potential perfect tree, which is the most expensive version that you could ever have in an appraisal setting. And so when it comes to something like what was being described is that a common species, very readily available, quick growing, was sited in a situation where the owner and grower realized that it had actually grown to substantially larger stature than was expected or appropriate for the given location. And so my simple point that I want people to take away as it relates to appraising and trees is that if it's a bad tree in a bad situation or in bad health, if the tree has had a section of it break off and there's decay and there's a fruiting fungal conch on the side, each of these things are cataloged and recognized. And so anybody who's out there who's looking at their tree thinking that they have all of this worked out in their brain, but that some professional appraiser is going to walk in there and, because we love trees, just put everything sky high. That's just not the way that the process works, and it wouldn't be acceptable to anybody in the whole kind of thread of the professional conversation related to these things for it to work that way. In many cases, these are the documents that end up in court. And so there are pretty stringent mechanisms to make sure that any two given arborists get somewhere close. And the more inappropriate a given tree is for a variety of reasons for a specific location, the less that it is valuable. And so something that is clearly to the owner not the right tree and not in the right place and not necessarily in a proper condition, those are all things that an appraiser will acknowledge and detract from that value of that tree. And so if you have a stately 150-year-old coast live oak and it's perfectly spaced and it's in pristine health, that's going to be an expensive tree. You have something that's essentially like a weedy tree, and you're getting to the point of trying to replace something like that, and it doesn't rise to something that is so significant in dollar terms that real estate agents are even going to balk at it.
Are you comfortable throwing out some ballpark numbers with those examples you gave?
I can give a specific example on a city tree, actually. Working on the side of things where Hanson is, so working on behalf of the city arborist arrangement with the city of Encinitas, I happened to be in a place where private tree contractors were topping a city tree. And I happened to be there at that moment and documented it as such, and worked with the city code enforcement staff and came up with, this was the first time I'd ever encountered this through the city processes. And so we then actually hired West Coast arborists, our contractors who do the things with the trees, to do an appraisal on that tree and essentially come up with a damage figure, which, as we're discussing, the city would be warranted 3 times that amount. And in the end, and I'm sort of sorry to admit this to our city people here, it cost more to have the appraiser come out and do the appraisal than that dollar figure ended up. And so that, this was a beautiful city-owned sycamore, just probably something in the range of 45, 50 years in the ground. And the amount that we were talking about was something like $1,200.
Okay, thank you for that information. We're going to get to public comment in a moment here, but I just want to lay out how we're going to move through this. So we'll do public comment, and then we'll get into the 13 questions that Linda has laid out to address. As she mentioned, Mayor Ehlers recommended that this go on to both Planning and Environmental Commission, so I want the public to be aware there's going to be multiple opportunities to make comment on this again. This is not the last chance. And I imagine that some of the questions we get to here may end up where we provide options to the next commission that it goes to, where we don't necessarily need to say this is one thing that we're standing by, but a recommendation of a couple options to consider if we're unable to come to consensus or if we feel like it's appropriate for one commissioner or the other to address a certain question. And with that, I think we're ready for public comment.
Katie Kramer. Hello, good evening. I'm Katie Kramer. I'm the current chair of the Environmental Commission. So I'm excited to hear that the mature tree ordinance will have a chance to look over it. But from what I've heard tonight and from what I've been following as it's made its way through the committee here, there's been so much thought and expertise and deliberation put into this. And so you've crafted a very thoughtful ordinance thus far. So I serve on 2 subcommittees of the Environmental Commission that have relevance to the Mature Tree Ordinance, the Climate Action Plan Subcommittee and the Native Plant Ordinance Subcommittee. And the Mature Tree Ordinance will further several of the goals of the Climate Action Plan and the Native Plant Ordinance. And I wholeheartedly support its approval. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how the Mature Tree Ordinance sort of harmonizes with these other city goals. First, retaining mature trees will help the city achieve its carbon sequestration goals under the cap, and will provide shading and cooling to help our community adapt to a warming climate. That's part of our climate adaptation plan. Second, retaining mature trees will help the city achieve its goal of protecting existing native plants, which is one of the main goals of the Native Plant Ordinance. And then third, Encinitas has been designated a Bee City USA affiliate, amplifying our city's dedication to supporting local pollinators by protecting their habitat and promoting the use of native plants and trees. And the Mature Tree Ordinance will greatly assist in those aims. And so in summary, this ordinance will help the city accomplish several of its environmental goals, will help the city retain its beauty and its character, will provide the local community an extra measure of kind of control over the design of development projects. And I wholeheartedly support its approval again. And this is really good timing to move this through. We're reaching an inflection point here in our city with high density development. And I've seen some other case studies of cities that have similar ordinances, and they passed these kind of when it was almost too late, when they had lost a lot of their trees in their urban forests. And so I think Encinitas is being smart and proactive in trying to get this through now. And so thank you again for all the work and expertise you put into this. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention, I'm not speaking for the whole Environmental Commission tonight. I'm just speaking on my own behalf. And thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Next, we have Brad Roth.
Good evening again. One item on page 3 of 6 on the document I was looking at, the Quercus demosa, it's on the tree list, and it's under the 4-inch at standard height. And Quercus demosa is a shrub growth, and it's never going to have, I don't think I've ever seen 4-inch, maybe 2 inches at the most. So it wouldn't qualify as, at a 4-inch diameter. And the Toyon, Heteromeles arbidifolia, I think should be on the list. Jepson describes it as its habit is a shrub or a small tree less than 10 meters. So I think that may qualify it as a tree. Also, a laurel sumac, Melisma larina, is a Cal Flora describes it as a tree or shrub that is native to California. So, and the Toyon, I've got one in my backyard. I can show you a photo on my cell phone that's a good 15 feet and probably 20 feet wide. And I know the laurel sumac, I've seen trunks on them this big. So they're, I think, a tree. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll be sure we address those when we get to the species list later on.
Sheila Cameron.
Good evening. You have my input, a couple of pages of it, and I went through every single thing on the revision and made comments as well. Linda, I know you've done a wonderful job on the committee, but I could hardly hear you. I don't know whether it's the microphones or not. Tony was very clear. You were almost impossible to hear. And part of it is those stupid computers are too high, and all of you need to be higher, and the thing needs to work. Okay, I would like to hear a response to all of my questions. I'd really appreciate it. And I had a question about Habitat Stewardship Program, and I didn't hear that mentioned. I'd like information on that. If a tree is not on your list, why are we even looking at it? That's what Julie Thunder brought up the other day, that there was a tree that wasn't on your list, and it shouldn't even be a consideration. I mean, flat out, big or no. I've asked over and over to eliminate the look back clause. If you don't eliminate it, give a specific time when it ticks off. Is it when the person walks in and says, I've just purchased this property? Whatever applies. Please do add toy and trees. They get to be 20 feet high. I think this 2-inch, 4-inch, 11-inch stuff is crap. Sorry. I know that you're using that a lot. All the arborists use it, but it's stupid. It really has nothing to do with whether or not a tree is native. You have Brad Roth here tonight, and he has suggested adding a tree, which I agree with. Brad is kind of a treasure of this city. I don't know if you know it. He's accomplished a lot environmentally. We're very lucky to have him, and it's a privilege that he's here addressing you. I haven't seen the Urban Forest Management Manual. Is that the original tree policy and maintenance policy? I don't know. I would also like to see you blend this policy into the current tree policy. I don't see the need, and I never have, for a separate mature tree ordinance. I know it was asked for by the last council, but I don't know that this council supports it. But we'll see what happens when it goes through the system. So the environmental group may have a lot to say about it. And anyway, I guess that's basically what I have to say. You've got my written comments, and I would like a clear response to each of them. You have done a good job, but I don't think it's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cameron. I have your comments printed out. I'll do my best to correlate those as we go through the revisions. Thank you.
Hi again. I didn't have time. I think after 12:30 today, item 4C was added, and it's 160-something pages, and so I admittedly don't totally understand all of the ins and outs of the mature tree ordinance or how it relates to native species or replanting native species, but I do appreciate, Linda, it's obvious that you put so much time into this, so I really appreciate it. I think it's really important. We've lost a lot of local control here. Our citizens overwhelmingly support local control, and our state has usurped that from us, and with the support of way too many people on our dais in the past couple decade or so. And this is one little way that we can try to keep some semblance of Encinitas. And so I do support trying to protect our trees. For example, and I would just ask a question because I'm not totally sure, when somebody removes a tree and they're required to put a native tree back, like, can we do anything on here when a developer is developing a property? Can we just ask them to do native trees instead of foreign trees? I'll give you an example. Quail Meadows is the biggest project that's in the works right now, 448 units alongside 140 and 202. disappointingly, one of our council members decided to relinquish her right to actually partake in representing the citizens when this project came before her, because she wanted to serve as a landscape architect for this project. She, Councilmember Lyons, District 3, is planting 49 trees, none of which are native. Only 3 of the species are on our tree list, not our native tree list, but just our tree list to plant. So 11 of the 49 trees aren't even on the approved list in our city, and our council member is designed that. Of the 116 shrubs that she's designed for Quail Meadows, not one single native shrub. And of the 205 flowers, not one single native flower. All from South Africa, South America, New Zealand, Australia, and China, Korea. So I think it's really important what you guys are doing, and I think it really will make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other public comments? All right, so my thought to move through this is that we're going to go through and address the questions that Linda has highlighted on the document and vote on them one at a time in hopes of just checking them off and moving on. Does that seem right? I feel like if we were to try to track them and vote on it in its entirety at the end, that might be a little difficult. Does that seem okay to just vote on them as we go down through the list? Okay, great. And then again, I want to emphasize that there will be more commissions and times for the public to weigh in on this. So I think, Linda, if you're
Just a quick question on the process that you're proposing. If there's a split vote or something, how would it then show up in the recommendation?
Right, thank you. So I think that if there's certain questions we come to where there's not clear consensus, it is an option to provide a number of options for either staff to weigh in on or for the next commission to weigh in on. We're not trying to come up with a finished, polished ordinance here. We're trying to come up with a recommendation for what we think is best. And there may be some items where Planning Commission or the Environmental Commission we may deem is more appropriate to revisit some of these, or council. So we'll put together the best number of options we can if there's not consensus, is what I think we should do.
I just have one question for clarification about a comment that staff made earlier, that our input to the subsequent commissions and council be in the form of recommendations. And what I'd like to understand is, are you discouraging us from delivering a sort of a finished ordinance recommendation, or not? Or do you want to see a series of recommendations about the current ordinance? Hey, we can delete this section, we can move this to a different part of the different ordinance, we want to change this way, et cetera.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so essentially what typically occurs when you go to a board or a committee with an ordinance that's drafted initially, the board and committee would review the drafted ordinances and basically make recommendations, so listing like bullet points of points that you would like to see incorporated. So that way when it gets to the city council, they can tell staff what they would like to see actually within the ordinance itself. What we can do though, because I understand that you guys have placed a lot of work, and I think a lot of the streamlining in terms of the way that it reads as well, and some of the minor changes that aren't necessarily substantive content changes, we would already incorporate prior to getting to the council. However, we just don't, we aren't able necessarily to incorporate significant changes to the overall ordinance that's already been seen by council without having their approval essentially to draft it as such. So we just want to ensure that we're able to provide council with your expertise as recommendations, and we're happy to take what you've provided in the ordinance updates in the format that you provided as those types of recommendations. We just want to ensure that we're in a format that council essentially can see here are the recommendations that the UFAC committee thinks is appropriate to include in the ordinance, and that way council can say, these are the facets and the new and great ideas that we would like to see incorporated in the actual language of the ordinance itself.
So again, so I understand, sorry if I'm being dense, but I want to make sure that we're headed in the right direction.
For sure.
It sounds like what you are recommending is that all of our recommendations tie back to the original ordinance. This part of the original ordinance, we want to change this specific thing, or we want to do this specific thing to it so that council can follow the changes rather than just saying, okay, the old ordinance we're not happy with, here's a new one for you to look at. I mean, is that the kind of recommendation you're making?
I believe so. I hope I'm understanding the question too, so I apologize if I'm not appropriately responding. But essentially, it's to provide them, yes, with the specific recommendations of changes you would like to see or areas that you would like to have better addressed in the ordinance, and then council can direct staff to be able to make physical changes to the ordinance itself.
How about this? Since we're pretty far down this road on where we're heading with this draft in front of us, if we take that into account and massage the language as much as we can tonight towards that direction, but approve what we have and then turn it over to you to frame it and then present it to the next commission or to council as what we came up with as just a general recommendation. Does that seem like, because I'm a little worried that what you're
Sure.
asking for is a pretty significant rewording of almost
Gotcha.
everything potentially. I think that's kind of what Mark is asking about.
Understood.
So I'm looking for a way to get what I feel is kind of close, particularly if we can get through these items, which is looking iffy. If we can get through all these items and present you something, this is what we like, can you take this and we can move it out of our committee to you and then you can take it to the next place? Does that work?
Yes, that works. We basically can take the format that you provide and we can format it as recommendations, or we can attempt to summarize what we hear at the end of this meeting if we're able to accomplish that. I don't want to throw a big wrench because you have already put so much work into this, and we greatly appreciate that work that you've already done. If it ends up being that we can't summarize it as well, we can also add it as an attachment separately as well. So there's a couple of options that we can move forward with. We just want to ensure that we're providing City Council with their ability to provide the direction on what they would like to see in that ordinance.
Okay, great.
So may I make a suggestion? Okay. I'll try to speak right into this so you can hear me. I know my voice is very soft. Okay, so my suggestion would be to go through the ordinance and address the items that we have outlined and turn that in with our work product to wherever the next level goes. And along with it, add a, Megan calls it a bullet point list, something similar to what I was talking about earlier today when I was explaining the differences between the original draft and our revision that would go along with the submittal to the next stage. So that would be my suggestion, that we do both. In order to do that, it would have to be written, that bullet point list or summary, and I don't know if that would need to come back before UFAC to be approved to then move on to the next committee, or if we can just turn it in.
Melissa, are you able to track language changes as we go through this to what's on here?
Could I please clarify something?
Sure, why not?
As a former city councilwoman and mayor, take your revision. Don't bother with what happened before. This council doesn't give a damn. What they want to see is what you've come up with. And if it's gone through environmental and they've made some changes, if it's gone through planning and they've made some adjustments, it goes to city council and they look it over and go with it or don't go with it. But don't go dragging up what was in the past. They've already seen that and they didn't like it. I hope that clarifies things a little bit for you.
Yeah, that's where I'm trying to head. I'm just listening to staff here. So there's going to be some changes we discuss and some language updates we make. Linda has been good about making those notes in the past and providing those. Is it better for her to do that in the way that she's been doing it? Are you able to track it on the fly here, or what's the best way to track these as we go?
I can try to run over the staff computer and see if I can pull up a working document. If not, then we'll probably have to defer to Linda to make the changes.
Are you up for it?
Yes, I won't be able to do it on the fly, but I will be able to do it post-meeting.
Okay, yeah, because we'll have the video.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, let's get into it then. Linda, are you comfortable leading us through your comments one at a time here?
Let's do it.
All right.
Try to get up close to this microphone. Okay.
So is there a way we can display what you're going through? There are 4 documents associated with this item. I want to make sure I'm in the right one, and I know. Okay, so that's perfect. If we can do that and sort of follow along with you, I think that'd be real helpful.
Perfect,
Okay,
thank
good.
you.
Mark, the one we're going to be looking at is marked item 4A, revision mature tree ordinance. So if you want to pull it up on your screen, you'll see it there. And then it has comments on the right-hand side, 1 through 13. And we're going to walk through those basically in order, I think is the easiest way to do it. Okay, so starting with comment number 1, it's on the applicability section. There's 3 ways this section could be written. One is very broad in that the ordinance would cover all public and private property in the city, with the only exceptions being what's written out in number 2 and 3, which is property in high or very high fire hazard severity zones and professional and growing operations. So that's the broadest way we could go. That's without having any exceptions. The second way we could go is any parcel zoned for single-family residence would be excluded from the ordinance. If we exclude single-family residence from the ordinance, it automatically excludes SB 9 properties. So the third way, the reason for that is because SB 9 is tied into single-family residential zoning. So if you exclude what I call SFR for shorthand for a single-family residence, you automatically exclude SB 9. The third way to go on it is to exclude SB 9 projects, but not exclude all single-family residential property. During our last meeting, a resident or committee member, I'm not sure who, asked about, well, how many SB 9 projects are there? How much are we talking about? Are we talking about 1,000 or are we talking about 5? You know, that's a very good question. So I did do the research on that, and the city provided me information about the number of applications under SB 9 there had been over the last 3 fiscal years. So from 2022 to 2023, 23 to 24, and 24 to 25, and then how many approvals there had been. Over that 3-year period, well, yeah, 2025 just concluded, so probably doesn't include the last few days of 2025. But over that period, there had been only 43 applications under SB 9 and only 12 approvals. So we're talking about a small number of properties that are SB 9. So the issue here on the applicability section is whether the members feel that we should make a recommendation to go broad and include all property within the city, to exclude SB 9 projects, or to exclude all single-family residential property. As the chairman explained, we don't have to have a single answer to it. If we do have a consensus, fine, we'll pass it along. If we have a split of opinion on the issue. We'll pass along what our split of opinion was and let the next folks decide where it should go. Ultimately, City Council is going to make the decision anyway.
I kind of feel that this is likely to end up sending some options, but I personally feel, both for the sake of streamlining and protecting as many trees as possible, the only exemption I personally would go with is number 3, the growing operations and orchards. We will also be addressing the value of mature trees in fire zones as actual buffers from fire, particularly wind-driven events in this committee. So I would like to push this in the direction of protecting as many trees as possible. But I also feel like maybe the best thing to do is to record our preferences. I'd like to hear from everybody on this one and then kind of see if there's whether we want to present some options or plant a flag in as few exemptions as possible. We want to just go down the line on this one? You want to start down there, Matt?
I agree with you. My only reservation is the same thing I've voiced in previous meetings, which is that it still seems quite limited in terms of the preservation of mature trees, even as such, as the recommendation that you're making and that's made here. But I would agree that the broader interpretation is correct. I mean, the penalty isn't so high, and the incentive should be to preserve the mature trees in the city. Thanks.
I want to bring this process way back just for kind of circle something into this for the sake of, in case there's anybody who's not aware, I know Evan is, but that at the earliest public comment kind of workshop meetings related to this, particularly those residents who live in the Leeuwenhoek area, this is a fairly substantial concern. And so I think that it's at least worth us acknowledging that there are many people among the public who are more and more concerned about fires in our city and the safety related to that. But then to kind of build on that from within this ordinance that we're developing itself, the primary concern, even in those conversations, and particularly in that area, are eucalyptus trees, which are, wholly excluded from being subject to protections in an ordinance like we're discussing. So I think that it's just worth kind of putting those two things on the table for discussion quality, but then also acknowledging that there are legitimate people's concerns who look at these dense stands of mostly volunteer eucalyptus in areas like Leeuwenhoek in particular, and see fire risk. And I want to just make sure to acknowledge that while also recognizing that this ordinance doesn't fall into that pitfall, because the trees that are the most kind of likely offenders are also not going to be protected by this ordinance. But then you do get into some interesting and a little bit of a complicated nuance with something like live oaks, which I have seen as recommended for not planting in high fire risk areas. And to be frank, I think that there's no science behind this. The notion that a mature tree versus an immature tree is somehow creating an elevated fire risk is something that I would want to see data to support with a vote. And in fact, the case studies that I'm most intimately familiar with seem to suggest probably the opposite as being true. And I think that we're kind of in agreement so far. And then I want to acknowledge that I am wary of something like this making people hate trees. And I know that I'm not alone in that. And so the discussion of breadth of scope is something that personally I've been advocating for. More tree protection is more better. And that's kind of my personal heartfelt sentiment about this subject. But I don't want to allow my version of the perfect to be an enemy of any kind of actual good. And so something that is positive is better than nothing. And even if we're only talking about specific sectors of property under certain development conditions, that's still a win for our trees. And so I'm not going to be somebody who is a strong stick in the mud about every single tree needs to be subject to this. If we get any trees remaining as a result of the work that we're doing, I consider that a win. And as we're discussing, it doesn't stop here. This continues to develop and evolve. So I also support not having an exclusion for the high fire zones.
Great, thank you. Linda?
I have to clarify your feeling about it. No protection for high fire zones, no exclusion, I'm sorry, for high fire zones. Did you want any other exclusions or no? That's what I wanted.
I have less strong personal feelings about that as a member of this committee. Or I should omit the word personal there. Like, I have very strong personal feelings about this subject. As I'm sitting here trying to do my best to represent what I know to be the truest sentiment of the people of this community, I would like some protection over no protection. And to that end, I don't necessarily need this to be every single family residence to get my vote. Whatever is agreeable in terms of which types of properties are subject to this kind of committee-wide is something that I'm likely to support.
Okay. I talk a lot, so I'm going to make my opinion simple. I would go broad and not have exclusions. I don't have a strong feeling about number 2, the high fire zone issue, but I would exclude the growing operations under 3, and other than 2 and 3, I would not have exclusions.
Great, thank you. Mim?
So I would also lean towards fewer exclusions beyond the professional growing operations. But it's clear to me that this needs public input. And so, so I think the next step should be really not up to us, but having it out there with as few exclusions as possible, protection for as many trees as possible, and then public comment. I know I'm here to support all of the work that you've done so far and to serve the people. So it's really, I'd like to hear the voice of the people.
Great, thank you. Mark?
I'm going to go on record as saying broad is good for me. The fewer exclusions, the better.
Thank you. Matt?
I vote for the original language, which was exempting all single-family residences.
Do you want to add any why to that?
Nope.
Okay. So I feel like we're in general consensus about keeping this pretty broad for the most part. Perhaps with staff's input here, I'm thinking our recommendation is to only include number 3 here, which is the professional growing operations, but note these other things under consideration and put this forth as our preference, with leaving in the other ones for other commissions and council to consider. Does that seem like a appropriate way forward here? Yeah. All right, so I will try to make a motion here to only include as our recommendation C3, but to leave the other ones on the record for further consideration by other commissions and council. Does that sound right? All right, do I have a second?
Second.
All right, we can take a vote on that, please.
Just for clarity, do you guys want to make a motion for each individual item or a consensus all at the end?
I think it's going to be easier to do them one at a time.
Okay.
It's going to be a lot of this computer stuff, but then we can just put it behind us.
Say the motion again.
Yeah, so the motion is to only include item C3 as our recommendation for the only exemption, but to keep the other ones on the record for further consideration by the next commission and council.
I'll second it this time, unless you don't need it. Okay.
I think we already have it. We just
Okay,
need the
good.
vote.
Okay, just wanted to keep it going.
You want to do second?
I'm sorry, are we voting on this? Because I don't see it on.
Yeah,
the
she's
screen.
working
Can
on
you
it.
guys repeat who
Oh.
the second motion was?
I motioned and Linda seconded. This will be good practice for you by the time we're done with this. Okay, great. That passes 6-1 with Committee Member Palumbo voting no. Linda, would you like to take us to the next item?
Okay, the next item is on page 2 under subdivision D, definitions. Under construction activity, we propose to strike the language building, demolition, grading, excavation, or paving. The reason for this is that we want to focus the ordinance really only on building buildings. So if, for example, let's say you have a commercial property owner in Encinitas who has a tree growing next to their driveway and they need to take it out, they shouldn't have to go through a permit process to take it out. They should just be able to take it out because it doesn't really have to do anything with building more structures in Encinitas, even though they would have to build a new driveway perhaps because they had to take out the tree. So that's the theory and the reason for taking out that language and keeping in just the language about requiring a construction activity being building buildings. So that's the idea behind that.
Great, thank you. I think this lines up with current council's stated goals of looking for tools to limit development. It also takes into account some public comment we'd gotten a few months back about a commercial property owner who the original ordinance was targeted at, only commercial properties, who was saying, you know, if the previous owner had planted a liquid amber or something that was lifting up the sidewalk and now his ADA access is not in compliance, is he going to have to go through some lengthy process to get permission to make his business now accessible, which I thought was a valid concern. But there's been some comments shared as well that we should not limit this construction activity. I don't think we all need to weigh in here, but does anyone have a thought they'd like to share?
Yeah, I do. I'm just concerned that this is sort of open a loophole for anybody to do anything. They may say, well, I'm just doing some grading, so I'm taking out all these trees. That seems like a pretty big, I don't know, a pretty big way to avoid the ordinance completely.
Yeah, I agree with Mark and Linda. I apologize. When we talked through this, I misunderstood the conversation. So, yeah, I feel like this. If we're talking about in comment 1 about preserving the maximum number of trees on private, individual residential property, and then we go here and we say, well, if you have to build a driveway, you can take a tree down, but if you have to build a house for a person, you can't. That to me seems backwards, so I don't support that.
I wonder if there's a way to address the concern without throwing out all the other construction activity, and that is maintenance of existing structures or driveways. I mean, obviously, if the tree makes the driveway or the parking lot unusable, it would fall maybe in a maintenance kind of situation.
What examples can we, the driveway sidewalk is an easy one, maybe a sewer main line is another easy one to think of. Are there any other, I worry about trying to name too many specific situations here.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't trying to necessarily list all possible situations, but just to give a way for somebody who's trying to do maintenance to, be able to maintain their structures without years-long bureaucratic involvement. And I know there are people who say, well, that tree over there has, raised a little bump in my asphalt parking lot. I don't know exactly where to draw the line between they're just working the system and maintenance, but it seems to me that the spirit of allowing people to maintain their existing structures is a good one.
What's the scenario where this applies, like at a commercial property? Because isn't this ordinance already saying that homeowners can do whatever they want?
No, not if we're removing that exemption, which we did in the first vote.
Oh, okay, I didn't understand that we did that 100%.
This is only still within the kind of umbrella of somebody applying for a discretionary permit, though, correct?
Correct.
So general homeowners doing non-permit requiring work would be functionally exempt for this as it's written already, wouldn't they?
Correct.
I would like to mention that these particular, the activities called out are actually some of the primary things that lead to the loss of mature trees. And this might sound kind of crazy, but adding soil is one of the main ways that people kill mature trees. And so something even seen as potentially of little consequence, if not benign, grade change down the road ends up with the tree that's thinning and something's wrong with it and there's a canker at the base of the trunk and the thing comes down. So I don't see the clear need, and then I feel like these are things that are dangerous to categorically exempt in terms of preserving mature trees. And then I also would like to just sort of reiterate what Matt said, that if you can take down a mature tree to redo your driveway, but you can't take down a mature tree to build somebody a new home, there feels something mistaken in that.
Great. I'm sensing some consensus here, barring anyone wanting to throw in some new language. Does someone want to make a motion to not make this change?
I move that we don't make the change in LS2.
Second.
All right, let's take a vote on that, please. All right, that passes unanimously. Let's keep rolling to LS3 here, please. Linda.
Okay, this is a scope issue. The mature tree, as it is defined in the ordinance, both in the original and in the revised, is basically broad, including all trees that are mature according to the definition. The question is whether the scope should be more limited to certain species that give Encinitas its community character. This is an issue we talked about at our meeting last month, whether we should let it be broad the way it is drafted or whether it should be more narrowed in terms of species. If it were to become more narrow, then you'd have to go to the drawing board and figure out which trees are most valuable to protect versus just the number of trees that you'd be protecting by going broad. So arguments on both sides could be, on one side, for example, go broad because you're going to protect the largest number of trees, and if the trees are removed, more trees are going to have to be replaced, versus should we be more in line with many other municipalities who like to just try to protect oaks, for example, or some other tree that's important to their community.
I think a lot of the goals of this ordinance would be lost if we just tried to come up with a handful of trees that we want to protect.
So just for clarity, leaving this in means any species of trees over 11 inches, barring some invasives that are mentioned later, is that correct? And then, I don't know if this is part of LS3 or would this native list become part of this question with LS3, or are we going to get into that with LS4?
The natives specifically don't come up with regard to the comments and the questions. Just the issue comes up as to whether to make this narrower than it was originally intended.
I would make a motion to not make it narrower. So that motion would be to
Keep the language the way it is.
keep the language the way it is.
I would second that motion.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Would the comment that we made make it incomplete to the future commissions and council review, or would we be striking the comment?
Oh, whether or not to leave that question in for further review? I think we're voting to remove the comment. I think it's clear enough that if someone else wants to narrow that or question it again, I don't think we need to highlight that any further than the sentence already does in itself.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's take a vote on that. So again, it's a double negative, voting yes to remove. All right, so that passes with Palumbo voting no and Altman abstaining. So now we're into LS4, which is the species list. There was a recommendation by Mark Wisniewski to add Mission Manzanita. We've had public comment, which I find incredibly valuable, to add a couple other species, all of which I'm in support of as well. I was going to ask Committee Member Gurno's opinion on Quercus tomentella, possibly adding into this list, knowing that it's rare but gaining in popularity. And also, Committee Member Gurno, if you could address the question of Quercus damosa at 4 inches, since I know that's a species of particular interest at the moment.
How much time do we have?
Not a lot. Can you do it quickly?
I think that Brad makes a very good point in that respect, and it's a difficult thing to really wrap your heads around until I finish my PhD on this very subject. We don't have consensus professionally, but there was a big change in scrub oak concepts and taxonomy, 2012, and so historically, there will be a lot of plants that are regarded as Quercus dumosa that will reach a 4-inch trunk diameter at standard height, and I'm going to be there arguing that that's not actually Quercus dumosa, but that's a little bit irrelevant to the material kind of field work involved in this conversation. I want to mention that a couple of the other cities that do also have Quercus dumosa on their protected list, or other scrub oaks like Quercus dorata, var gabrielensis up in LA. There are other, I don't want to muddy this up too much, but 4-inch trunk at standard height is the issue. It's about 4.5 feet up. And many of the Quercus dumosa that I was just talking about at the Manchester Preserve don't reach that height at all. And so you wouldn't even have anything to actually measure. And one of the ways that we could get around that would be to come up with an arbitrary different height. It gets a little confounded. Some of these other ordinances have basically decided that the appropriate approach to working with scrub oaks that are delicate ecologically is to pick whatever it may be, the 3-4 biggest diameter branches, stems, trunks, growth points on the given tree, measure those in combination. And so this is something where you would get to 4 inches on any kind of respectable, even true to my version of type Quercus dumosa as long as you didn't do it at height. And then regarding the species, I would actually like to add another one into the mix. This was prompted by Mark's comments last month. Comera staphylos diversifolia. I don't expect anybody to be familiar with it. They're quite rare, but they do grow in the city naturally, and they should have protection as much as anything, and they do get to size.
All right, I think we're probably going to be in consensus of adding these natives that were mentioned. Would you agree that tomentella deserves to be on that list?
I think that's a really opportune thing to include in here because it's more likely to be encountered in our city than some of the things that are already on the list, and the city staff is actively planting them.
Great. And then my other thought is I wanted to add in something here about regularly revisiting this list, adding some kind of, and I'm looking to staff for this, adding some kind of mechanism where, because things change, there may be a, like we dealt with the canary palm, there may be an insect or something that targets one of these and may want to clear the way for removal on some of them. There may be a new tree that comes into fashion that's getting planted more that we want to add into this list. So would adding a line here about recommending we revisit this list with some kind of regularity, whether that's once a year in this committee, once every 2 years, or something, is there a mechanism you can think that would be of utility to regularly revisit this?
So you can certainly make the recommendation to regularly revisit this item and the species list. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to make amendments to ordinances regularly. So you could reference a separate species list within this document, and then that could be more regularly updated, and we could bring that back. So that way it's not necessarily within the ordinance itself, but it's the list that could be brought back to UFAC. But you can certainly make a recommendation one way or another, and we can include that with this as well.
Okay, thank you. Linda, did you have something?
Yeah, I do. On page 3, under the trees that should not be used for replacement plantings, the first bullet point says city-defined invasive trees, which includes all tree species identified by the County of San Diego as invasive species. So what you could do, instead of using a 4-inch trunk for a native tree as a definition or way to define it, you could define it by referencing perhaps the native tree species list that's perhaps being developed by the native plant committee or something like that, so that you don't have to have a specific list of trees here, but incorporate a list that is going to be more flexible and evolving over time.
How about this? Because I do like this list. I would hate for any of these to fall off through cross-referencing lists. We know we've had a lot of trouble with that. If Committee Member Gurno can make a recommendation for Demosa, I think that we should add all of these native species we're talking about, carve out a special classification for Quercus demosa, which is difficult to measure from what we've heard, and then add in some language to make sure this is reconciled with the native plant ordinance, and a recommendation that we can hope to revisit this list with some regularity. Am I getting close to something there?
Yeah, it's a tough one, but functionally what my recommendation would be as it relates to Quercus so here's what I would recommend with something like a Quercus demosa, prostrate plants in many cases. If you were to pick 3 branches and have them meet the 4-inch diameter in summation, that's going to be a mature Quercus demosa.
And just for the record, too, a Quercus demosa is considered a little oak. Is that correct?
They are the littlest of our little oaks.
Great. Okay, so, and then I don't think Rus integrifolia was brought up. Would we want to consider lemonade berry as well?
I think that's a great candidate. There are some definite big old growth specimens that reach this kind of diameter at the standard height.
Okay, and then in terms of toyon, lemonade berry, and laurel sumac, would we want those in the 9-inch category, or no, 4-inch would probably be more appropriate for a few of those? I'm looking at you, Tony, because you're the...
Sorry, I forget that not everybody's as into this stuff as I am. Heteromeles, the toyon, gets to be like more of a true tree and is often single trunked. I think it may be appropriate to put that into the bigger diameter category because there are a lot of big toyons around town, but if they're in that size category, they are really the mature toyons that we do want to protect. Lemonade berry is on the margin in my mind, and then melasma tends to have so many epicormic kind of water sprout type new branches and shoots coming out that it's going to be difficult to get to a 9-inch diameter on any of those. 4-inch diameter on a single trunk of laurel sumac is a big mature laurel sumac.
Okay, great. I'm going to take a stab here. Let's add Quercus tomentella to the 9-inch trunk list. Heteromeles arbutifolia to the 9-inch trunk list. Rus integrifolia and melasma laurina to the 4-inch trunk list. And I'll be able to help you out with these after the fact. And I'm sorry, can you repeat your recommendation for Quercus domosa?
For Quercus tumosa, I would recommend that if the 3 selected branches in combination reach the 4-inch diameter, that it's a mature protectable species. And I'd also recommend that Comer's Staphylos diversifolia is in the 4-inch at standard height category.
Okay, great. So I'm going to make a motion to include those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 recommendations we just made, as well as a recommendation to reconcile this with the upcoming native plant ordinance, as well as a recommendation to revisit this list regularly in a way that staff deems appropriate. And I think that's my motion.
So quick discussion.
Yep.
I believe we also wanted a third category with just one entry, Quercus tumosa, that says it's an aggregate of the 3 largest. So right now there are 2 categories, just the 9-inch and the 4-inch, and it seems like there would be a third category now with 1 tree in it.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'd like to add that to the motion as well. Everyone following along there? Is there a second to the motion?
I just want to clarify, this is the LS4 and not LS5.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the idea of listing the oak that has to be combined 3 branches in order to get the 4 inches is because it's an oak and it's a native, not because it's really a very big tree.
It's a particularly special native endemic to this region. Is that correct, Tony?
Just seems like we're getting a little into native plants and not mature trees as they would typically.
It is a particularly special plant that goes along with the name of the city that I think from the
sounds nice.
From the
That sounds
outset of the of this ordinance, we have gone out of our way to carve out protection for this for those reasons.
Just want to be careful we don't go too far. That sounds like a good reason. I just
Yep.
want to be careful we don't go
Yep,
too
thank
far.
you.
Yeah, I mean, it's would be protecting the mature Quercus tumosa, which wouldn't be protected with this sort of larger screen that we use for other trees.
Correct.
Something that I would mention in that respect is that in terms of like the landscape ecology or horticultural utility, they do serve the persistent woody role of a tree. They just don't quite have the stature that we're accustomed to.
Yes, thank you. All right, so I have a motion out there that hopefully is clear enough.
I'll second that.
Is everybody comfortable with voting on it as is? Does anyone need any further clarification? All right, let's take a vote on that, please. All right, so looking at the clock, it's 7:25. We have gone through 4 of 13 items. I'm personally comfortable with carrying on here and getting through this. This is an important one. Is everybody comfortable with continuing on and trying to get through this tonight?
I think we want to set a limit. We want to extend it by a specific amount of time. I know city council sometimes goes pretty late, but we're probably not in that category.
Might be tonight. Well, should we say 8 or 8:30?
8, can we do 8? And go.
We can try for 8. Let's just try to pick up the pace, I guess. All right, so I'll make a motion to continue the meeting until 8 o'clock.
I'll second that.
Okay, great. So let's pick up the pace, and then we'll just get as far as we can. If we don't make it, we'll continue this at the next meeting. I do want to make sure we get to the agenda item on voting where we're going to hold the meetings. So let's save a few minutes for that at the end, but let's keep going here with LS5, I believe.
Okay, this might be good news. 5, 7, 8, and 9 are probably a clump that all have to do with the same issue, and that is whether to add back into the ordinance the replacement tree scheme that was set forth in the original ordinance. So if you want to look at that, it can be found in the original draft of the ordinance, which was the reason that extra packet was added in today. It was from last month's meeting. The original ordinance had, if trees are removed, they would either be relocated, replaced, or a fee would be paid. And the revision took out the replacement tree and just put in fees instead. One of the difficulties with just having fees that go to the city and having the city fully in charge of replacing the trees is, number one, the money can sit in a pot and not get spent, or nobody takes care of it and gets the trees done, it gets forgotten. And also having the requirement to replace trees and the hierarchy of whether it's native or not native and how many had to be replaced, and sort of the whole scheme about how you'd have to go about replacing those trees created something of a burden on the developers to have to do all of that, which further incentivizes developers not to take out mature trees because they're going to have to go through all of that process in order to replace them. Also, per my earlier report on communications with the planning department staff, apparently the city council really likes the replacement tree program. So all of these items all had to do with whether or not replacement trees were being included in the suggested revision. So let's see. If you're able to pull up the original draft from the city, let's see. Too many drops. Okay. I think it was in. Okay, so it was on page 4, item G, number 5. The following hierarchy applies when preservation of a mature tree is infeasible. A was relocating the tree, which we don't want to revisit. But B is the mature tree will be replaced according to this section. And that's what we're talking about putting back into the ordinance. Then subdivision M on page 7 is where the replacement scheme is located in the original ordinance. And it goes through a 3-to-1 ratio. If you're replacing the tree on the same private property development site, then number 2 is a 4-to-1 ratio if you're replacing it on a different property site. Then it has specifics about that. And then if under number 3, if you're using native species, you can have a smaller number of trees to replace. So if we add back in the replacement trees, it affects each of those different comments in the proposed revision.
And just so I understand, again, if we remove this replacement requirement, then we are diverting funds into to the city to use for tree care and tree replacement at their discretion. Is that correct?
That's right.
Well, that isn't actually what the Encinitas Habitat Stewardship is, and it's listed as going into that program, which is the open space management program. I don't think that there's an exactly the most appropriate pool that we have access to, so I'm not suggesting that that's a wrong direction. I just want to make sure that we're clear that mostly we have shrublands, and so most of the work in that open space management actually doesn't have much to do with trees.
That's right. If it was going to just be a fund, that's the reason we included the Habitat Stewardship Fund description in the materials, is it's really not the appropriate fund to put this tree money into. If it was going to be just the city being responsible for replacing trees on public property, that's not the right fund. I don't know if there is another fund in the city that it would be more appropriate, but likely there would have to be a specific fund set up to receive these funds to replace trees. And so that would be, another thing that the city would have to do is set up that fund. But we've been counseled, per my discussion with staff, we've been counseled against it because, replacing the trees and involving the developers in the replacement of the trees was found to be something that was desirable to incentivize developers to not take out mature trees so they didn't have to go through all that. So I guess if there was a motion to be made, it would be to add back into our suggested revision the provisions in the initial draft under subdivision G and M that provide for replacement of trees as a mitigation instead of excluding it as the revision now stands.
I think one problem with replacing trees is that, regardless of how big you plant them, it takes them quite a long time to make up for, generally it's accepted as 30 years lost of the value of the trees before you get back to a mature tree that's doing what the mature tree that was removed is doing. So I'm not sure where I stand on this at the moment. I feel like this was something that I remember Planning Commission got a bit stuck in the weeds on, and it seems like something a lot of people have opinions on. So I'm trying to think of a way to state our preference, but leave a couple options on the table for down the road.
Well, one thing you have to consider is that if we're talking about replacement trees, then a mature tree is being removed. It's just a question of what the mitigation for that fact will be. Is it just pay money into a fund and let the city do tree replacement? Or is it engaging the developer in the tree replacement process? That's basically, what you're talking about, going one way or the other.
Can I chime in? So I just don't want everything lumped together and I just don't want this to go by so quickly. Like last month, it seemed to, I know you guys have been at this for a very long time, but I would like to see protection of fruit trees and the inclusion of fruit trees as replacement trees. So I don't want to skip over that section. I know you've all made a big decision about this, but I want to advocate for their inclusion.
And which item would that fall under?
That was LS5.
That would be under LS5. Oh, I see, yes, right there.
And so, sorry. So when you start looking down as the second bullet point, it says no fruit trees are, they're not to be two things. They're not supposed to be classified as mature trees nor used as replacement trees. And I would push against both of those. I realize they're not very common as mature trees here, but I still would not want to see one come out just because it's allowed to take it out.
That's interesting because most trees have some kind of fruit, right? I mean, you see a pretty big mulberry now and then,
And some of the ones that were mentioned tonight also have potentially things you could call fruit.
Yeah, I mean, some things eat the figs from the fig trees that we have downtown too. Not humans, but yeah, maybe fruit trees I'm not sure what fruit trees means anymore.
A great reason not to exclude them.
The opposite thought on that, I guess, which I think you make a good point, especially when it says fruit trees of any kind. But, if a homeowner puts a fruit tree in and has it for several years and then can't change that out to another fruit tree, I think that was the discussion originally as to why it was in there, is that to give people the ability it's kind of more of a food crop, I guess.
I do understand the reasoning and it makes sense, but I also see that it like in Olevenheim that was mentioned before, like there are big swaths of land that could become developed, and there are the original first mango groves, commercial mango groves, where there are mature mango trees that could be removed very easily with this ordinance. And so I just want to protect them.
Well, I think we have a different exclusion for commercial orchards and things like that. So,
There are only a couple trees left.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't want to totally just move to a different subject arbitrarily, but I don't mean to be dismissive, Mem. That's how I will say it, because I appreciate what you're saying, and I kind of am sitting on the fence a little bit, particularly what comes to my mind when you mention that. There aren't that many fruit trees that get to be, 11 inches at standard height, but something that would be some of these cherishable old avocado trees in Leucadia, for example. And then more specific to kind of what Linda brought up and trying to move on this, I don't see our city as struggling to plant trees. And so I have kind of reservations about the replacement regime being portrayed as a real concrete need in order to hit some kind of like annual number of planted trees, because citywide we're doing a pretty good job of that. My struggle with not having the notion of an on-site replacement regime even be part of this is that amounts to a slow loss of mature trees on private property, which is specifically where we need the most encouragement of retention, because public works staff and city park staff, they're not trying to go out and cut down mature trees, and they are planting a lot of trees. And so what I would see is almost like a slow kind of brain drain type of a situation with private trees going down, public trees being planted, and that's not ideal, but it's really complicated to do any other way as I see it.
I think we can maybe get through LS5 because that doesn't, it's really just about these 4 bullet points, right? So what if the motion is so we have invasive trees, monocot species, including all palms and palm relatives, and trees that have been designated as heritage trees because those are covered under a separate ordinance. And then MIM wants to take fruit trees off of this list. So if we take fruit trees off of this list and we keep the language in, the replacement question itself will be dealt with at another item down here. Is that correct? So I'll make a motion to remove fruit trees from this list, but keep the language as is, as written.
Second.
So now, any fruit tree that would be 11 inches or bigger would require a permit on a homeowner's property, the way we created exclusions previously on what properties it addresses? Except for date palms. Except for date palms?
Except for date palms, that's correct.
And accepting professional growing grounds.
Right.
And only under the umbrella of somebody prospectively applying for a discretionary development permit.
Say that last thing again.
No private trees are protected if nobody is looking to develop, including any size of fruit tree. So this is, as written, only a recommendation for any tree to be subject to protection under the guise of somebody prospectively applying for a discretionary development permit.
Okay. I'm sorry, I thought earlier we said that we excluded all single-family residences. It was just the ones that potentially could be developed in the next 2 years.
So we removed an exclusion for single-family residences, but that means only those single-family residences where somebody is applying for a discretionary development permit would their trees be subject to this protective ordinance.
Yeah. That's how I'd originally understood it. That's why.
So you have a fruit tree in your backyard that is no longer producing and you want to change it out because your kid's allergic to oranges or something, you are free to do so, unless you're planning to build an ADU or something. This might become an issue for you. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
All right, so on LS5, my motion is to keep the language as is in this sentence: the following trees shall not be classified as mature trees regardless of size, nor shall they be used for replacement plantings, to remove fruit trees from these bullet points and to keep the language.
I think Matt seconded that.
All right, so let's go down to LS6 now.
This was brought up last meeting as well, whether public utilities, fire departments, et cetera, should basically be subject to the ordinance and have to pay mitigation if they remove mature trees.
Would this be the city paying money to itself?
Could be.
I'm going to try to expedite this one and make a motion to not have such entities be subject to this regulation, considering that it's focused on discretionary development permits, which are not relevant to them, and I don't see any goodwill coming from prohibition of pruning trees around power lines.
I second that motion. All right, to LS7. That motion passes unanimously. To LS7, Linda, can you walk us through this one?
This one is, the way the ordinance was originally written, tree replacement was required before the mitigation of fees. If the way the revision is written, we don't have tree replacement, we have only fees. So where that leaves us is that if the city violated the ordinance in removing mature trees from city property, should the city have to pay fees into the fund to replace those trees? When it was an issue of just replacing the trees, that made more sense, but having the city pay for trees that it has removed into a fund makes less sense.
Yeah, this doesn't make sense to me either, having the city pay into that fund.
Wouldn't they just waive the fees anyway?
So I guess the motion on this one would be to strike the language as shown on the draft or public improvement project area.
I will second the motion to strike the language. All right, that passes unanimously. Got some momentum now. Let's go on to LS8.
Number 8, there was discussion at our last meeting about the mitigation of the appraised cost of the tree. And the suggestion was to add into that fee mitigation the cost of replacing a tree as well. So the suggestion in number 8 is whether or not the added cost of replacing the tree should be included as part of the mitigation to pay fees. This again is based on the assumption that the ordinance does not have replacement of trees in it. So if we added back in replacement of trees, this would be an issue that we probably wouldn't need.
All right, so let's make a motion to, I will make a motion to add in the cost. If we do not, if replacement does not make it back into the final draft, then let's add in the cost pending that decision. Does that make sense?
So just a quick comment, and this sort of refers back to what Tony mentioned about the appraisal being worth more than the tree. I think we should add the cost of the appraisal also. If you're adding the cost of the tree, it doesn't make sense that the city's got to spend $1,000 on an appraisal to recoup a $50 tree, and
I think that's a very astute observation. Would you like to make a...
Is there a permit? Would that be included in the permit fee to make sure that the permit fee includes the cost of an appraisal?
I'll confess to not having thought this through very well.
I mean, if the city's in charge of doing the appraisal, it seems like might make sense.
Well, yeah, that's a good question because in some cases, yeah, that's an interesting thought because you're going to have private appraisers and it's going to be variable. It does seem a shame. The only way I could see that the city would need to be on the hook for that expense without changing language would be if there was an enforcement activity, like if somebody cut down a tree without getting a permit, because wouldn't that person have to pay for the appraisal as part of the permit submission process in most cases? But if they were to just cut a mature tree down without a permit, that's when the city would have to step in and do the appraisal and potentially need to recoup those fees.
Okay, so maybe my comment is moot. Right?
I don't know that it is, Mark, because if you have a situation where somebody is violating this ordinance and is subject to the 3 times the damages of the value of the tree, that could also then include recuperation of the appraisal costs on behalf of the city. I guess that, like what Brad said already makes sense generally speaking, and when it comes to appraisal costs, the way that I would suggest it be loosely phrased is that any instances where there's violation of this ordinance and it requires city appraisal of private trees, that those expenses are subject to recuperation by the city.
But what if there's not violation?
In
other
that case,
words-
the people proposing the removal of the tree are going to privately be paying for that appraisal up front anyway.
How about, I'm looking at the clock, and we have 10 minutes to 8, and we've reached a bit of a question mark. So my thought is to pause debate on the mature tree ordinance here, let the subcommittee address this specific issue, and pick up here next month. My thought also is for the subcommittee to get together with staff, seeing how we've gone on this so far, and think about how to address the remaining questions if we want to approach this in a different way next month. I feel like we can probably get through the last couple next month and get there, but if there's any changes to scope or the way that we're going to do this, the subcommittee can work on that in the next month. Is that all right with everyone if we pause here before we vote on LS8? Linda, are you good with that?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So can we move on from this agenda item as is, or do we need to do anything to formally close this, or not close the hearing, but to move on?
Okay, so do you guys want a motion to move this to the next meeting?
Yeah, let's make a motion to pause here, keep everything open, and pick up here at the next meeting.
Second.
I second that.
And probably to move the remaining agenda items to next month also. That we
There
don't
is
get-
one I do want to address, but yes, we'll get to those in a second.
Yeah.
All right, so we voted to move on to that next month. Melissa, can you pull up the agenda for us, please? So we were on number 4. I'm going to move to, do we have to vote on moving 5 and 6 to the next? Okay, so I'm going to make a motion to move 5 and 6, agenda items 5 and 6 to the meeting next month.
I'll
And-
second that.
Thank you. How about, sorry, I'd like to make an amendment there. Move items 5, 6, and 8 to the meeting next month.
I'll second it again.
Thank you. All right, so that's passed unanimously. So we're going to look at number 7 now. Just to provide some context on how we ended up here, there had been a number of concerns shared over the last couple of meetings over the last year or so that people were not able to hear us in the poinsettia room. We do not have microphones in there, and some of us speak quietly. I had asked about, there's, plugs in the wall there, and I asked about the availability of microphones to set up in there, and staff came back with a recommendation that we're moving to here. And that's how we ended up here. So I don't know if there's a presentation or something from your end we need to consider. It's just up to us to vote whether or not we want to continue in here. And is there any conflicts that are created by us meeting in here? Is there no regular Thursday meetings? Does anybody have any questions or comments? Are there any pink cards for this item?
I have a comment if nobody from the public, or a question, I'm sorry.
We do have a public comment on this one?
We were wondering, were you going to talk about what? There's no staff report on it? No.
Yeah, just so we're super clear, I had emailed staff asking about microphone availability in there, and they wrote back and said we're meeting in here. That's the extent of what's happened so far. And, with a push for transparency and addressing concerns of members who could not hear us over there, this was a solution to get us microphones. I think we did okay for our first meeting here. I'd like to keep that going as long as it's not an imposition on staff. And I think it also makes it easier to get it onto the YouTube channel, which to me is a value for the transparency.
I have a comment about it.
Please.
My comment is that when we're in the poinsettia room, number one, I do have a very soft voice. I do my best to speak up, but still, a microphone is a great benefit for me. And the other thing is that when I'm listening to members of the public in the poinsettia room, I have a really hard time hearing what people are saying. And I found tonight having people come up to the podium and speak into the microphone was a great benefit for me. I could hear much better, as well as being able to hear the committee members a lot better. So just for what it's worth, audio is much better in this room than it is in the other room.
And I would just like to add that I've only been to 2 meetings, one of each, and I already miss the intimacy, the being able to really see each other when we speak from the other room, but I do think that this is more important to have the transparency and the ease of hearing each other. I'm hearing from the public more clearly and having them be able to hear us.
Yeah, we're losing a little camaraderie, but yeah, it's definitely got some functional benefits.
From my perspective, one of the things that I try to do is not totally dominate the conversation. I'm not always that good at it, and this actually kind of helps facilitate a little bit of a more equitable, floor time in a way, even though I have done a lot of talking tonight. I know we have some fiscal concerns generally among people and politicians in our city, and it looks to me like we basically have all of the same staff sequestered here, maybe a little bit of extra because it's our first time and we're growing into this, but would anybody from the city side be able to speak to whether this is just comparable in terms of the expense footprint relative to what we were doing in the poinsettia room?
It is comparable. I am just here this meeting to help assist with training and making sure that the program is understood. As far as staff time, this probably will actually save a little staff time. We're moving this over to our agenda management system. It'll be easier for Melissa to upload documents and keep things streamlined.
Thank you for that.
All right, keeping in mind that this might save a little staff time and it addresses the concerns of transparency and just participation with the public and everyone being able to hear, I'll make a motion to
Do you guys want to go to public comment first?
Oh, there is a pink card now?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, I didn't realize that.
Okay, thank you. You explained how we got from there to here, which is good. And I never liked this situation there. It was fine for you to all be kissy-face with each other, but nobody else knew what the hell was going on because we couldn't hear you. So this is much better. But what I'm going to do is have a real good talk with staff regarding the microphones. There's always been a problem with yours, Linda. Matt couldn't hear anything you were saying. You were barely speaking up. You got to suck on it. You remember Janis Joplin? Okay? That's what you got to do with a mic. And I think as long as you have permission from whoever you get permission from and you're here, this is better. And you'll get used to it. And you're not all as cozy as you were, but a little separation is good sometimes. Anyway, the mic system has to be squared away for everybody because the city council, we have the same problem. Okay, anything else you want me to say? All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for the recommendations on mic technique. And I agree this is a better situation. So with that, I'd like to make a motion to continue meeting in here.
Second.
I'd be happy to second the motion.
Oh,
We got a second from Mem.
my mic wasn't working.
All right, that motion passes, and I think we're good to adjourn the meeting at 7:50.